Good morning, dear lovely community. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to meet with each other and support each other as we walk this path towards more spiritual integrity. The idea for this webinar has been around for a while because we all want to do better. We all want to have integrity. We all want to be ethical and do our best and be as professional as we can be. And so very often oh yeah, the code of ethics, yeah, sure. And sometimes we found that we can glide through with a great intention, glide through tenets of a code of ethics and find that actually, if we really dig into them, this is asking a little bit more of us than what we might have thought initially. And so with that in mind, we decided, all right, let's just pull 3 and have a conversation about it and see if we can learn from each other when we tease in and have deeper inquiry together as a community around how we interpret these 3 tenets of the code. And can we learn from each other, because we'll all see them in different ways. And so this is a place for us to share and learn from each other and dig in to see, well, how did I interpret this when I did sign up, if there's somebody here who is a member, and how can I dive in deeper to learn more? And so I'm going to hand over to Phil, who, just logistically, we're asking people to click the reactions button and click on the raised hand if you'd like to speak. And our guideline is 20 minutes pretty much for each of the 3 tenets, give or take. And that might give us some space to dive in and think about this in a new way with each other's support. So over to you, Phil.
Okay, thanks, Jack. Hello, everybody. I was recruited to moderate this discussion, and I'm hoping you will all make it easy to do. When we first put together the code, and some of us spent a lot of time fine-tuning it and getting the wording right, we knew from the beginning that these are not carved in stone, and that they would change, and that we no doubt had left things out and maybe weren't precise enough in some of our language. And even knowing that even if we had done a magnificent job of articulating those principles, they would be subject to interpretation, and that we would all benefit from ongoing conversation. I mean, if Thomas Jefferson can write the Declaration of Independence and it'd still be people fighting over it all these years later, not to mention, 10 Commandments, yamas and niyamas, these things have to be fluid and require flexibility of interpretation. And we always envisioned that we would have a robust ongoing conversation and perhaps someday modify the website with different perspectives on many of these, if not all of the tenets. So this is part of that process. And I think everything in the code should be subject to that kind of rigorous discussion. So we would ask that, as Jack said, you all know how to raise your hand virtually by going to reactions and clicking on reactions, and you'll see raise hand. That's what you do, and we'll see that. So please don't just unmute yourself and start talking. We don't want people talking over one another and all that. And when you do have a comment, or something you want to present to the group, if you could just, we could all be courteous and not monopolize the time, try to be as concise as we can so other people can enter. Jack, Renato, people are still coming, so could you keep your eye on the admit signal? So with that, I suppose we should just open it up, and our first subject of discussion is number 13. I'll just read it. Maybe we can all just take it in contemplatively for a moment and think about it. And maybe you already have, maybe you can't wait to give us your take on things and your concerns. So I'll read it. Acknowledging that regardless of our spiritual attainment, we're human beings with human personalities, limitations, drives, and needs. I already have things to say. So, who would like to begin by telling us your take on it or your concerns or whatever? I see Jay Roberts. Is there a first name? John, I don't hear you. Is it John J? What is the J?
Unmute yourself, Mr. Roberts.
You're muted or your microphone isn't working. You're not being heard. While he's getting his technology, you okay? Leave us a message in the chat. Rick.
Okay, so I'll try to keep this brief, but I wanted to keep it flowing. So this is something that I have come to understand better and better over the decades, because I have had a tendency, as maybe some of you have, to idealize certain spiritual leaders and teachers and gurus and so on, and to consider them to be something beyond human, which in a sense we all are. I mean, we all have a dimension to our being that is beyond the human or even beyond the manifest. But in the manifest realm, I believe we are all, human, and therefore, oh, thank you. You want me to open this? Okay, hang on. Opening a jar.
Talk about being human.
Yeah.
Don't drip it.
I won't drip it. Can't open it.
Straight.
There, yeah, I got it. Superhuman strength, Anyway, as time has gone on, I've, kind of, you could say, gotten disillusioned, but that word has a positive connotation, because I mean, if we're on the spiritual path, we want to come out of illusion, right? We want to sort of see things clearly and not just fool ourselves. And so I've had to continually reassess and rethink this point. And I often interact with people who haven't done so yet. I'll give you one anecdote and then I'll stop and let others talk. My wife and I went to see Amma many times over the years. And I was on a Amma chat group with this woman, with a bunch of people, but there was one woman who was arguing that Amma is omniscient. And I said, you mean like she knows what we're typing right now? And she said, yeah, she's really omniscient. She knows everything. And then it turned out that this woman got breast cancer, and she was terribly disillusioned and disappointed because she thought Amma should have known this and told her about it, or, you know, been able to do something. And I didn't want to say I told you so, but I hope she kind of got the point and, you know, realized that, you know, no human being is omniscient. And, you know, and the superhuman powers that we often, you know, confer upon those who inspire us, we're going to be disappointed if we do that, which is not to say we should just not respect them or hold them in high regard, someone like Ramana Maharshi, for instance. But I mean, I recently got into a conversation with David Godman about what a ferocious temper he could have, and sometimes very unfairly, apparently, just, you know, really screaming at somebody for feeding an animal on the property, which, you know, he would have done himself. And so I don't know, maybe that was that guy's karma, but I think we need to always realize that if someone occupies a human body, they're going to have limitations. And if we're expecting perfection, we are going to be disappointed. Okay, that's enough from me.
Jack, are you going to do the calling on people?
Yeah, and Annie, you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, hi, Jack and everybody. Just very briefly, I don't know how you could refine this anymore. It's about people's understanding, but this is a very needed idea insofar as, you know, so many people are brought up, myself included. I was part of a group that the guru was beyond any reproach and all that. And this is an entirely liberating point that we can't leave behind our human side. So I really can't contribute in terms of refining this. I think
Testing.
Yeah, I think it just kind of says what it needs to say. And it will be a learning curve for quite a few people that have been part of these communities that have seen their teacher as beyond the pale. But I think it will also serve as a very healing and liberating part of the code of ethics. So I'm all for it. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you, Annie. Connie?
Hi, everybody. I
Hey.
think I love this point. I think this point is an antidote to projection, that, you know, what each of you was describing was attributing some kind of perfection to the teacher. And that's an unconscious process. And so I would add something here about unconscious, maybe unconscious needs or drives, maybe just blind spots, something like that.
Yeah.
Because there's so much in ourselves that we will never become aware of and that has the potential to act out harmfully. Thanks.
Said
Wonderful.
our resident expert in the shadow.
Thank you, Vern.
Hello, hi. You know, I'm a UCC clergy person, and I'm on what's called a Unified Fitness Review Committee for clergy members who are accused of boundary violations, as we call them. And I like the general tenor of it, but you know, I would suggest that maybe you spell some of these needs, drives, and desires out, and perhaps say that these are responsibilities for us to maintain outside of our spiritual community. So we all have the need for friendship and belonging. We all have sexual needs. We all have financial needs, and that we take responsibility of maintaining those needs outside of our spiritual community that we may have been called to lead.
Good point. Thank you, Vern. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, from my own experience, noticing that when some spiritual teachers don't have a support system, like friends that are not their students, that's when the needs have to get met someplace else. And of course, then, like, when there's a denial of those needs, we're in trouble. So it's kind of like there's two layers, isn't there? Because, you know, if we deny the needs in the first place, well, no, my awakening has taken care of everything. And then we don't have a support system, as Vern, as you so appropriately said, the responsibilities are ours and they must lie. The resolution, the meeting of these responsibilities of these needs must be outside of our community. That's the glitch. I think that's an extra pressure that goes on communities and makes the whole thing go awry. Great point.
Hello all. I'm in England, as you can probably tell, and I ran into the ASI through somebody I know who is a teacher. I'm not a spiritual teacher. I would never have the self to say that I'm a spiritual teacher, but I think signing up to something like this is valuable to give a reference to people who want to know what they're letting themselves in for if they're engaging with someone who they don't know. I have a lot of problems with this. It is well-intentioned, I will say. I've worked for many years as a therapist, and I note a certain therapeutic taste in the whole thing. It's exactly like the sort of honor code I had to sign up with my organization, which is hypnotherapy. However, I have significant issues with it, which I'll come to as quickly as I can. Firstly, there's too much mention of self in here. If we're talking of spiritual teaching, which in itself is an extremely slippery phrase, spiritual, a lot of issues there, but self-sufficiency, self-awareness. True self is no self. And should spiritual teachers be referring so much to self? Self's what you want to have out of this whole equation. No self, please. Specifically, the ones that were mentioned, 13, 14, and 15, I confess I should have read it more carefully before I signed up. But number 13, I have a huge problem with. Yes, if you have not had the grace arrive at you that leads to what is called enlightenment, completely awful word, as we all know. But if you have not been graced with that, then of course you're human. My question is this: is a caterpillar a butterfly? No, it is not. One comes from the other. Of course, of course, of course. And no enlightenment is complete as long as anyone is alive, has a body. As long as you've got a body, you're not fully enlightened. You're a human. You have a human aspect to you. And there is huge room for self-deception in the whole area, as we all know. But saying that once you have been gifted that grace, you're still human. No, you're not. That's the whole point of it. Once you are graced with that change, the death of the self, you're not human, because human is self. That's what human is. So I think it's a very well-meaning, I understand the purpose it is aiming at, because it's trying to deal with self-aggrandizement, it's trying to deal with massive extensions of ego, it's trying to deal with falsity in teaching. But nonetheless, if you are in fact spiritually enlightened, no, you're not human anymore.
John, can I intervene with a question?
Of course.
You seem to have contradicted yourself. If I may, you said as long as the person has a body, then yes, indeed, they are human. And now you're saying,
no, I said that not exactly. Carry on.
Well, that's maybe I misunderstood you or it wasn't clear, but we're talking about embodied teachers who
Correct.
are in human form, regardless of what may transpire when they're no longer embodied. So would you agree that an embodied teacher, regardless of spiritual attainment, is nevertheless still a human being?
No, I would not.
You
I
would say
said
they
that
are
as
non-human.
there's not many of them around, let's face it. Let's take Ramana Maharshi, for example, possibly as an example. Post-human, I'd say. This, we all can bring up our own examples. What I said was, as long as you have a body, you are not free of self. There's always got to be some self in the individual, because it is individualized by having a body. That's self.
And
But
would
the
that
self
body be human?
is minimal. No, the body is sapiens, it's not human. Human is being human. When you stop being human, you're no longer a human being. You're being. That's the point I would make. I don't want to go on forever. So I'll just very rapidly say on points 14 and 15, the same thing applies to point 14, because if somebody
John,
has...
if I may, we're going to take each one of them in sequence.
Oh,
so
okay.
could you
I
hold off
understand.
on 14?
I missed that bit. So
Okay.
in that
great.
case, I finished and will happily listen to everybody else.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we, Rick, your hand is up?
You're muted, Rick.
Yep, just had to click it. So I would ask John, he doesn't need to respond, but rhetorically I would ask, if the wave realizes that it's the ocean, is it no longer a wave? I would argue that it might say to itself, well, yeah, now I know I'm the ocean, but I'm still a wave. And the wave, my individual waveness might be a small portion of my oceanic nature that I now realize, but it's still a wave. And it's subject to all the frailties and vulnerabilities that waves have. I know at least two examples of teachers who quite egregiously misbehaved with numerous women who claimed that they didn't exist and that it was just the physical body experiencing sensations, but they weren't involved, or it was God doing it and they weren't involved. And I think that's BS, personally. I think that we'll always be a human as long as we are alive, by meaning we'll always have some, well, John used the word, some semblance of individuality, which is subject to error and which we need to keep an eye on. And there's a phrase in Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, it's called Lesha Vidya, which means faint remains of ignorance. And it's said that the most enlightened person that ever walked the planet still needs that in order, if they're going to be alive and functioning as a human being. There's always going to be some remnant of ignorance, of shadow, of fallibility. Anyway, that's my point. I'm going to go grab some soup. I'll be right back.
Thank you, Rick. Julie.
Yes, about the drive and the needs. To me, like friendship outside of a community, sexuality outside of community. But when it gets slippery is the financial need, because if I am to offer a service and I am in charge of this body needs food and shelter, so a fair price, I know it's a slippery subject. Otherwise, I wouldn't do this and I can do something else. So that place to me is a gray area where I don't want to debate that, but if we're including the needs, then the discussion around needs may be needed. But probably it's already been going on and I wasn't there. But I'd say with the financial needs, there could be more clarity or discussion around that. And what is a fair price, then that's for everyone to decide for their own self. It doesn't need to be totally free, although there's nothing wrong with that either. So when I heard someone mention the needs, then I was just aware of that aspect, because I'm a very good web designer and I could do that as well. So if I'm to offer something in any way it shows up, there will be a price attached to the service. So that's what I gotta say about this.
And Julie, there's often, rhetoric, that, well, your attainment was for free. What you have seen was for free. It's grace. However, it took me years of living in India, like years of, not that India was a specific place, but I could live there cheaply because I wanted to meditate 24/7. And nothing comes for free. You mightn't have a transaction with God to attain enlightenment, but by gum, you pay very often in your health. Very often you pay the price of your marriage. You certainly pay the price of a phenomenal career, and yet you still have bills to pay. And so how do we reconcile this against a culture that says donation is what real teachers do? And so it's about inquiring deep within and getting emotion out of it, and being a responsible adult around responding to our own needs in a fair way that's in integrity with our own value system. I think that's where we start on an individual basis. But that's me personally now, not an ASI.
And I was happy to pay for anyone to guide me and support me on my own process. So I was glad that was offered, and I wasn't in any obligation to buy anything.
Thank you, Julie. John, can we ask you to make it brief?
You're muted again, John.
I have one question. Could somebody that hasn't achieved spiritual enlightenment teach spirituality at all anyway? I can't see how.
What was that? Could you repeat?
How can anybody who is not spiritually enlightened, in quotes, teach anything about spiritual life?
I could offer a quick response. Phil and I taught meditation for decades, and maybe some of you did too. Neither of us claimed to be spiritually enlightened, but we were helpful. Like, some kid goes to school and he comes home and he's in the first grade, and his younger sister says, "What did you learn today?" And he says, "Well, I learned A and B and C." And she says, "What else?" And he says, "I don't know, I'll tell you tomorrow." Because tomorrow he learns D, E, and F. So, every spiritual teacher out there is somewhere along the path. No, not, very few, if any, are at the summit, if there is a summit. And yet we're all kind of helping each other along if we have something valuable to offer.
I want to add one thing to this before we move on to the next tenet. And we're not locked into these 20-minute installments. We could take longer. We have an hour, another hour. If let's say John is absolutely correct, let's say on some level, somebody who reaches the heights of enlightenment is beyond human, to the point where, as John would call them, not human any longer. If that were true, then we would still be in the place where how would we know who such people are? And because we wouldn't know who such people are, we would only have their word for it. And what if they were lying or self-deceived? What then? What if we thought we could tell who those people are? Would it mean that whatever they did while walking around in a body was not to be questioned or judged, regardless of what the behavior was, because somehow we assume they are beyond human needs and human desires and human personality structures. Even if we were to accept John's premise as true, we would still be in have a problem with projection and self-deception and unscrupulous people making claims about themselves. So I don't see where it's a solution to anything about ethics and moral behavior. That's something to throw in there.
May I respond?
Please.
The issue here is taking anything outside one's own remit as being an authority. And that is the problem. The arrival at grace is the arrival at auto-authority because self disappears. And once self is gone, you've got the truth of self, which is no self. And no self doesn't have an external authority. The problem is projecting authority onto an external figure that allows for any form of abuse. Everything has to actually come from within, not without. And of course, eventually within and without disappear as well. So I see the difficulty is in setting oneself up as a spiritual teacher in the first place, really. As far as I don't do any such thing. However, that's all I can say for the moment.
Well, nevertheless, there are spiritual teachers, and that's who.
Unfortunately, yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to be leaving now. Bye-bye.
Thank you, John.
We'll take Maren and then move on to number 14, if that's okay. On to the next one.
Sure.
Thanks, Maren.
Listening to all this, I was just thinking about how I can't get away from the fact that I'm in a body, and it seems like everything that I continue to learn in this lifetime is because I'm in a body and because I have relationships with people who die and things that happen in the world and realizations I have about my childhood or whatever, or things I'm noticing that are coming forward, and it's because I have a brain, because I have a body, and because I'm mortal, and because that I have this fleshy being, and so I feel really liberated by contemplating number 13. I feel liberated in not being only seen as a spiritual person. I'm a physical person, and it makes me think of like two people I know of who I admire. One is Thich Nhat Hanh, who talked a lot about his grief over his mother's death. And then another person who is a famous alpine skier, Michaela Schifrin, whose father died. And her physical capacity as an Olympic and World Cup athlete was impacted by grieving her father. And Thich Nhat Hanh was also impacted by grieving his mother. And so I feel so much liberation in being able to say, I am going to be going through these passages until I stop breathing, because I am in embodied relationship with all the other beings that are around me. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you, Maren. Bill, would you like to go on to number 14? See what it unearths?
Okay, we can come back to this, and we should also be aware that there's a lot of overlap and interaction among many of the points. And so when we talk about 14 and 15, the humanness that is highlighted in 13 will no doubt be referenced. And where is 14 now? Where am I? Okay, I'll read it. Not seeking or presuming exalted privileges or glorified status because of our role as spiritual teachers. That's loaded.
Vern, would you like to come in on that?
This is another good point. I would just mention that like I serve in the congregational in terms of like congregational polity, and there is sometimes a role of the prophetic dimension of ministry. So sometimes, we might try to encourage more affordable housing and bias it with the local police. What we say is that our greatest power is by suggestion, and that over time a community might come to trust us to listen to what we have to say, but that we have to work hard to earn that respect. So there is, when you say not seeking or presuming, I would say that sometimes it is good to seek as a spiritual leader. And let's remember that there are certain elements of spirituality that can also be political, and then it can also be social. But pressuring or exalted privilege, when a minister that serves a community for 40 years might actually be given exalted privileges. But again, that's just because of that long-term role in a community that is sort of given to them. And it only happens if the person isn't arrogant and, running people down in order to get that position. But I think you need to have a reasonable understanding of, that, as Martin Luther King says, love without power is nostalgia. Power without love is abuse, and so a spiritual leader does eventually wield power. So I just wanted to be aware of that. And yeah, that's from my perspective. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Vern. I think you were right to single out what I consider the sort of operative words here, which is seeking and presuming. Spiritual teachers will be given privileges, whether it's, the church residence or free meals or whatever it might be, or good pay or whatever. It's the seeking and the presuming that I think are the key words in this. And so maybe we could tease this out a little bit more, and how people in the position of being spiritual teachers deal with not expecting, not seeking or presuming to be put on a pedestal or to be exalted, but find it happening anyway.
And coupled with the role of a spiritual teacher, it's a role, or it becomes your identity. Which is it? Because if it's a role, we have some distance from it. But if we don't see it as a role, oops, it leads us into, blind spots, inevitable blind spots. Harry, can we hear what you'd like to say?
Namaste, all of you there. Yeah, I'm from Nepal. State having majority in Hindus. However, by politics, it's a secular nation. As a university teacher, I did my doctorate in the teaching of the Gita, a holy text full of wisdom. So I'm going to share my thoughts and observation on point number 14, which I found really useful, and it's really the point to note for the spiritual leaders at present that we need to have exposure to as many common people as we can. But in our practice, if you go back, the spiritual leaders seem to be seeking a sort of, glorified status or looking something different, or it's a part of traditional culture. So this creates a sort of hierarchy at present time. So the present leaders, spiritual leaders, need to be very simple and addressing and having everyday very common life. If we go that way, yes, we can demonstrate in life how spirituality is common to everyone, and how being a common man following the path of spirituality, we can transform our own life and the life of millions and thousands and millions of others. So yes, thank you so much. Just to show my agreement with point number 14 in present context in Nepal and globally as well.
I
Thank
think
you, Hari.
Mahatma Gandhi was a good example of that. He's very simple. He spent a lot of time weaving and things just to perhaps to emphasize that he didn't want to have convey an exalted impression. He wanted people to realize he was a common man, and yet that made him all the more lovable.
Right. Exactly.
And staying at that side of the world, Krish, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Just give me a hands up. Yeah. So it kind of reminded me, I'd once gone to stay with one of the branch offices of the Dalai Lama in Bodh Gaya. And I remembered very clearly that the kitchen, I'd gone to Bodh Gaya and I'd gone to stay in one of the offices of the Dalai Lama. And in that particular office, they divided the kitchen into two. And we were not allowed to use, it was an exact replica of the kitchen. This side of the kitchen and that side of the kitchen had all the utensils, all the stuffs, but you could not cross over and use a ladle or a microwave on that side. And it was completely this. And I was quite surprised to hear that that was the case with all the offices worldwide. So I think 50 or 60 offices had kitchens which were this. And I remember thinking that such a lot of waste of money, and does the Dalai Lama know this and is he party to it? Or at the same time, in my own personal work, for whatever it is, I've noticed that people are always willing to come and pick me up at the airports, drop me, and it's a hell of a lot of convenience, particularly if one is traveling to another country. If people are willing to pick you, drop you, host you, it makes life easy, let's put it that way. If I were to come to the States and I'd have to figure my travel and stay in a hotel, it makes life more easier. So, two things. One is, I think what I've done in the past is I don't ask for it, all right? And if it comes, I don't say no to it. That's what I have practiced in the past. That's one. And second is, once in a while, I will do a cleanse, which is that for a period of 3 months to 6 months, I will say no to all offers that are made. So any offers and every offer that is made, I will take a period of cleanse and say that for these 3 months or 6 months, I'll take no help, no support. I will not inform anybody that I'm arriving. I will take the local transport or the taxi on my own and so on and so forth. So these are a couple of things that I just thought I would share. Thank you.
Thank you, Krish. Anybody? Any hands? I'll raise a question, see if that stimulates any conversation. I would guess that many of us, if not all of us, have been in the position of being teachers, being in a teaching situation, and trying to be an ordinary, humble person, but at the same time liking comforts, and often needing it, especially if you're traveling and all that. And I get very uncomfortable when people assume I'm something I'm not, assuming I'm wiser than I am, more evolved than I am, or more important than I am. And I know there's a kind of ambivalent reaction that many of us have, which is it feels good. And at the same time, it makes me uncomfortable. So how do we deal with people who wish or need to confer some kind of glorified status to us, even when it makes us uncomfortable, but it might be something they need or want?
You know, this is part of the training to become a psychologist, what you're describing. I mean, we wouldn't call it so much moral development, but that's what it is. But this is part of the training, is to learn to identify when you're carrying that projection for someone, which we call it transference. And in our spiritual arena, you know, the transference of God, the divine, the holy. I mean, it isn't just a human parent. We're not just recreating our mothers. Some people are actually, but there's also a deeper, broader projection of the divine. And so what we're taught in our training is to, and I would call this shadow awareness, you know, in my lingo, is to become sensitized to that in your student or your client, and wait until the right moment in the relationship when you can hand that back to them. You know, most of the teachers, I remember Muktananda always talking about God, Guru, Self are all the same, right? And most of the teachers had some kind of way of saying that, but not living it, because they hold to the projection. Because as you were saying, Phil, it feels good to feel blown up by hundreds or even millions of people who worship you in that way. So for me, I come back to this clinical work, which is what's the right moment when you can give that back? And the person, in this case, the student, the devotee, the disciple, can begin to carry her own light, her own wisdom, her own power. And it seems to me that that's a big place where these relationships fail us.
Thank you, Connie. Yeah, that's very rich. And I think if we're unaware of how we might be getting off on the exaltation and the projections and the transference. If we're unaware of it, we have no way of tracking our students to see when is appropriate for their growth to be handed back that power that they've given us, which is not ours to use at all. And so, you know, it would be useful, I think, for each of us to ask, is there any part of me that gets a little bit high? Is there any part of me that enjoys with attachment? Because we'll all have that dopamine hit, you know, when everybody is just eating out of your hand, who's sitting in the room. It's something happens chemically inside us, and it shuts down our empathy and it drugs us. And are we attached to it? Are we needing that? Or can we stand back and notice what our body is doing? And then we can track our students and hand it back. So I think there's layers to it, isn't there? Annie?
Yeah, just to comment on Phil when he was speaking, his safeguard was very apparent because he did have this question about, you know, how do I handle this? So his human side was very active in acknowledging the play of this, which I thought was a very beautiful example of, you know, what naturally takes place if you are aware of, you know, the ego and its, you know, vicissitudes. So I just thought it was a very good example of maybe how to approach that. And, you know, like, what do I do? There's a lot of power in not knowing, but yet investigating. So I think that's a beautiful approach myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Two thoughts. One, this is the kind of point that also speaks to the utility of healthy institutions. Healthy spiritual institutions have oversight and some accountability, and the people in them are kept, their egos are kept in check, and any sign of seeking or presuming exalted privilege, there's some oversight in the healthy spiritual organizations. The unhealthy ones, it's almost like a competition to see who could be more exalted. And of course, we're addressing, you know, one of the reasons ASI was established in the first place was with an emphasis to people who are not part of a lineage or an institution and are functioning as independent spiritual teachers, where it's all up to them to oversee themselves, which is difficult. I want to add one thing to this. I was in, well, I won't name the person, but I was in the presence of somebody who was held in high spiritual esteem, and there are cultural issues involved. I've been on lecture tours in India, and people say, "Oh, you wrote these books, you must be a very important person," and they'll touch my feet or put garlands around me, and I can't stand it. It makes me crazy. And I was with somebody who was treated that way. Some, you know, people came by and touched her feet and all that. And afterward, I said, "How do you deal with this?" And she said it was really hard, and I would shoo them away and all that. And then somebody said, "No, this is not about you. It's what they need to do, and in their culture, it's an accepted and important thing to do." And so it could get a little complicated sometimes, you know, when you factor those things in. Anyway, other hands, or shall we?
We could move on to number 15. Brandy, your hand was up. I wonder, would you like to pop in?
I just had a really quick question about the power, handing the power back. I'm wondering why you don't hand it back in that moment. Why do you have to wait? And I just didn't understand why there
Well,
was.
because there are really valid reasons for this mechanism of projection, as we're saying. you know, Phil was saying some of it's cultural, but there are valid reasons, there are valid needs inside of us when we're doing that, when we're attributing some things that we don't want to see in ourselves to a teacher. And so they need to carry that for us for a while, like a guide or a mentor or a guru or a Roshi. And it's appropriate at certain stages on the path to have that dynamic. And then it's not anymore. And it's the same thing in therapy. And it's tricky. I mean, it's subtle. It's really subtle. And you have to kind of watch for whether the person resists. You know, what is the right moment where, like Phil was describing, you can express your own limitation or your own flaw. You can equalize things that way. You can humanize yourself. That's one way of doing it. There are a bunch of different ways of doing it. But there are times where it's appropriate. If abuse starts to happen, as you know, we are exploring in ASI and in my own writing, I'm exploring spiritual abuse. If that starts to happen, then that projection is an obstacle because it doesn't allow you, it pushes you into denial and doesn't allow you to actually see the reality of what's happening. And so then the projection becomes a defense against the truth. Sorry, I don't want to.
No, that's really great, Connie. Thank you for
you.
bringing down. Yeah, and it makes me feel that like each one of these points could be a webinar because there's nuances inside of nuances in each of these tenets. Barbara?
Yes, thanks everybody for this wonderful conversation. It's indeed very rich. And I do have a question because the word attainment stays with me, and English is not my first language, so I might be overlooking something here. But what helped for me to get clarity and to remove the pedestal that I had underneath some teachers was to realize that they didn't have anything more than me, but something less. And that seems to be so different than the word attainment. So I just wanted to ask for some clarification.
Thank you, Barbara. Phil, would you like to pick that up?
Did I use is the word attainment used somewhere?
Yeah, it's
Oh, in 13.
Regardless, regardless of
Spiritual attainment, yeah. Well, that is assuming that there are such things as levels of spiritual growth, you could say, or development, states of consciousness, states of awakening. At the very least, learning, you may, on one level, say, you know, the teacher is no better than you, but the teacher may know things you don't. And so in that respect, there's a teacher-student relationship. But 13 assumes levels of spiritual development, you could say, or, you know, if you don't like the word attainment. Does that make it any better? We could, you know, a lot of what's being said here comes back to something we discussed when we first put this together, which was to have a forum where people can make comments online and you know, have an ongoing sort of examination of these things. Maybe some people would be more comfortable with the word development or growth or something instead of attainment. That's my thought. Anybody else?
Yeah, attainment has a kind of a materialistic connotation, like you attain wealth or you attain political power or something like that. But I think we know what we mean by the word, but there might be a better word, because someone like presumably Jesus Christ or, you know, had a level of spiritual attainment, which we don't. And there was a spiritual maturity or a degree of evolution or whatever we want to call it. But it doesn't necessarily imply possessiveness or egotism or any other things that might go along with vast wealth or, power in a worldly sense. Spiritual maturity is a good word, or advancement or some such thing. But I don't think there's anything wrong with the idea that there is a spectrum of spiritual
Right.
growth, and people are at various stages on that spectrum.
Some of these points may require some footnoting over, eventually. Should we move on to 15? Jack, Rick, you okay with that?
Yeah.
All right, let me read it. We have a half hour. Never manipulating, exploiting, or deceiving a student to satisfy our personal aspirations, needs, or desires. Anybody want to argue with that one?
I think, one thing that weaves through the three of these tenets for me is what's our motivation to be a teacher in the first place. And, the classic answer that tends to be kind of politically correct is, well, it was inevitable and I was asked to teach again and again and it became obvious. And in a way, that's a cop-out, even though it's what I've said for years, because it is what happened to me. But it is also a cop-out because it doesn't give us an opportunity to check to see what is our internal motivation. And what is in your unconscious about a motivation. Because you do have status. You do have privileges. Yes, there is all these culturally designated exaltations that come. And how do we interface with that if we're not even recognizing what our own motivation is? So knowing what is motivating me to be a spiritual teacher and somehow will enable me to have my finger a little bit more on the pulse, to know where can I exploit? Where am I using my students, using my practices to fulfill an inner motivation that I'm not recognizing? Because if I don't recognize why I want to be a teacher, I won't even notice how I'm exploiting. I won't, because I won't know my need that's being filled by being a teacher. So I think there's layers to this. Rick?
Yeah, I just want to point out that in my experience, this is a very important point because there are so many egregious examples of teachers using their status to do these things that are listed in this point. I can think of one guy who has, I won't mention his name, but he discovered that one of his students had, and this happened several times with this guy, he discovered that one of his students had gotten a large inheritance, $900,000 or some such thing, and hadn't told him right away. And as soon as he found out about this, he said, oh my God, don't you realize this money has Asuric energies in it? And I need to purify it for you. Otherwise, it'll be disastrous for your spiritual evolution. And the guy actually signed over the money to this character. And then he realized later he made a big mistake. And I think even last time I heard, he was still going through a legal battle trying to get it back. So there's that. And then there are examples of teachers, many examples we've all heard about of teachers exploiting people sexually, or, deceiving them in various ways. So it's a broad point, but it's actually a common phenomenon. And it's very unfortunate because it really hurts people. I know of someone who committed suicide because of a similar thing where she had given all her money over and then realized it was a big mistake, couldn't get it back. Her life went downhill and boom. So very serious point.
Thank you, Rick. Yep, good points. Annie?
Yeah, here I am again. But I mean, I was just very taken with what you said, Jack, about really being honest about your intention. What is motivating you to be a spiritual teacher? Maybe that should be in the code of ethics somewhere as a point of contemplation. I don't know. And I just want to say very briefly, I might be creating a pattern here just because it makes the mind feel good. But it feels like 13 will stymie the inevitability or the possibility of 14, and 14 will stymie 15. Feels like they work in sort of there's a pattern there. The main one being recognize your human self. Don't get lost. That's like, to me, the keystone of the whole thing. And will take a certain amount of maturity to even like understand, that's at a point that'll click. But I just wanted to point out that kind of came to me, that there seems to be one will prevent the next, so to speak, as we roll along. So thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Yep. Bill, would you like to pick something up?
Well, I was just thinking that picking up on what you said, being aware of our, to amplify Annie's, to refer back to 13, to be aware of our humanness. And as much as I like to think I approach my work with some humility, it feels good to be in front of an audience and have them laugh when I want them to laugh, and thank me at the end, and tell me that it was very important, something I said really was of great value to them. So you can't deny that there's ego gratification in this, even if you're doing something you believe is your calling, and you were called to do it, and it's not like a careerism or anything like that. It does feel good and it's satisfying. Otherwise, we wouldn't continue to do it. Spiritual teachers are not martyrs. So being in touch with those things and keeping them in check, I think is a terribly important thing. But there's a line between, we're back to 15 now. Yes, there's a line between getting, personal satisfaction or the occasional privilege, or, and manipulating, exploiting, and deceiving, as opposed to being, modestly rewarded for your efforts, or, appreciated. Those are very different things from manipulation and exploitation. If we had to have one premise only, this might be a very good candidate.
And if we're not aware of our personal aspirations, and we deny our human needs, and we have, our desires are in the shadow because we want to believe we've transcended desires, we're naturally going to assume that, we therefore don't manipulate, exploit, or deceive. There's a big difference, isn't there, between emotional maturity and spiritual maturity?
Well, I think people like Connie would say they should complement one another.
Yeah. Yeah. We need the emotional maturity. That's part of what's behind the ASI. Vern?
One thing I've noticed with spiritual leaders is that a lot of times when they cross over a boundary, whether it be adultery or financial infidelity, or just doing stuff like that, a lot of it is related to like burnout. And so a lot of times it is a slippery slope where a spiritual leader is doing great, has amazing spiritual gifts, develops a good reputation in the community, is asked to do something and something else and something else and something else. And a lot of times these sorts of things start happening unconsciously. So, it's just, to be able to encourage emerging spiritual leaders with the ASI to have a good, to take their own self-care seriously and have a sense of like what that means. Sabbaticals, vacations, those sorts of normal things are good to remind people of. That's all. Thank you.
Great point. Thank you, Vern. Rick?
My point relates to what Vern just said, which is that we don't change radically overnight. And any change we make, for better or for worse, happens incrementally and often unbeknownst to us. It's the old frog in the slowly heating water analogy. And you've all probably seen that documentary, The Social Dilemma, about how people go deeper and deeper down rabbit holes by watching things on YouTube. And it's that way, I think, with every cult and, with every or many spiritual organizations, either the individual's indoctrination or the entire trajectory of the cult itself can go off in a certain off the rails, but never overnight. It just sort of gradually happens over time. And the first thing, if we want to use the word Maya, the first thing Maya does is delude you to the fact that you're deluded. It blinds you to the fact that you're blinded, so that you think you're just fine, and yet you're going deeper and deeper into that blindness. There's a great quote that I'll close with in this little segment from Padmasambhava that you may have heard me say before, which he said, although my awareness is as vast as the sky, my attention to karma is as fine as a grain of barley flour. So this guy was saying, all right, I'm pretty cosmic, but I absolutely have to be meticulous in my self-scrutiny because my cosmicness doesn't excuse or doesn't save me from going astray if I'm not careful.
Thank you, Rick.
I would throw it open. I'm curious if anybody cares to weigh in, whether any of you in your position as spiritual leaders have found yourself manipulating, exploiting, or deceiving unconsciously for your own needs, or been tempted to. I know that's a big ask to own up to it.
There's some hands going up, but also this will be on YouTube, so there's a fine line there. But there are hands.
That's true.
Just to have that, in the recording, that yes, people are saying, "Yep, I see myself in that." Just to acknowledge your honesty. Thank you.
Well, I used to be on this program in the TM movement called Purusha. It was a monastic program, and we had to raise $1,000 a month for our upkeep. And, I couldn't walk into a room without kind of feeling like a Western gunfighter, sort of scanning the room like for likely victims, so somebody I could hit up for donation. It colored my perspective on people. It made me unnatural in terms of my interaction with people, and I really hated it. And everybody was like that on Purusha. And some guys were really good. They raised tons of money and they would go on Hawaiian vacations and things like that. Other guys were just barely making it. But it was a kind of a built-in exploitation factor that was imposed upon us. And I didn't like it one bit.
I'd like to add to the one practice, I suppose, that many of us would have had on our spiritual path is saying yes. Saying yes to the divine, or yielding personal will to divine will. And what can happen is that we forget that we will have human boundaries that we have to attend to and reestablish. We forget that our yes isn't actually, it is our yes to whatever wants to happen can override our responsibility for self-care, as Vern brought up. It can override having our finger on the pulse to manage our own needs, because no, the universe takes care of it. We can bypass ourselves into a very precarious position of where we're not taking care of our own needs. And that, you know, what will happen then is our survival mechanism, of course, will lean us towards wanting to exploit. So it's subtle here. It's subtle here that if we're not mature enough about that, yes, the universe wants me to teach, even though I don't want to teach. Oh, some part of you does. Some part of us does. Some part of us does. Because why are we saying yes to the divine over yes to our own inner motivation? Like the yes that is surrendering personal will to divine will in some way serves us, even if it only means it will mean more spiritual attainment. Somewhere our agenda is always in there, no matter how we try to hide from it.
It also occurs to me that we should be aware of the different levels of manipulation, exploitation, and deception. I mean, when we read this, we think people seducing students and telling them it'll be good for their spiritual growth if they sleep with the teacher. Or we think of people lying in order to get people to give them money or something like that. But there may be more innocent and even unconscious ways that we can manipulate or exploit or deceive. And there's a fine line. I did a biography of Yogananda, who's held to be a very exalted spiritual leader by not just his disciples, but people who read his autobiography. Well, I read a lot of the letters where he was bugging disciples for money because he had to pay the bills, and they had mortgages, and they had salaries to pay. Is that exploitation? Because he was the guru, he was the master, and he often at least hinted that there was good karma to be had, divine blessing to be had by supporting this important cause. Is that deception? Is it manipulation? Is it unethical? It's very, the need was there. He wasn't doing it so he could own a better car. He was doing it so that, the bills would be paid. And so these
could be deception, but it could also be true.
Could be.
Yeah.
That's right. Could be both.
I mean, we should ask Jim Baker, but I don't know which prison he's in.
There's some hands up.
Vern?
Yeah, thank you for taking, I'm sorry I'm weighing in so much. But I would say, for me, like my denomination said, it's a good practice for the pastor to look at the financials and know who's donating what. And that was really scary for me to do. It's not something I wanted to do. But I did. And the truth is, as a spiritual leader, like somebody who makes a giant financial contribution, the reality is they're going to have more say in the organization than somebody who doesn't. And there's an awareness that's developed about their needs, which supersedes perhaps other parishioners that are in that church. And I hated that part of it. if this person was more conservative than I am, I'm pretty liberal. I'd have to be careful about what I said from the pulpit because I didn't want to anger that person and drive and ruin the financial capability of the church or even my own salary or all that kind of stuff. And so I would just say, I just want to shine a little bit more light on the slippery slope between influence and manipulation, and that manipulation can go both ways. And that a spiritual leader has to be aware also of the influence of various people in their inner circle on their own. And, that, for example, Jesus and his treasurer, Judas, there's a lot, there's a lot to be said about that. But, and also, I have a family, I have 3 children, I'm married, I've been married for the last, 24 years. And sometimes maybe what I thought was great inspiration for a sermon to talk about various family members overcoming alcoholism, say, it seemed like a great idea at the time, but then in retrospect, maybe I shouldn't have lifted that up. It sure made for a powerful sermon during the time, but maybe made my family members feel uncomfortable. And so, again, another slippery slope. Was that manipulation? Was that, what I mean? It was kind of like, yeah. So I think that all spiritual leaders just need to be really aware of how easy it is to be manipulated by others or manipulate other people.
Thanks, Vern. I want to point out that we don't have a whole lot of time left, and there's at least one person with a hand up who we haven't heard from yet. Victoria.
Hi. I'm listening to the conversation. First of all, I'll express this is the first call I've participated. I just heard of the organization through the Harvard thing that was done a couple of weeks ago. And I'm struck, it's I don't even know how to put this into words, but I am very blessed. I've spent almost my whole life around different indigenous communities, both formally and informally, meaning being accepted into one particular lineage as a formal student, taught as if I was a child, born there. And what strikes me is how much there is to learn from communities like that and how they treat elders, and how elders are exemplars within the communities. And it's a lot of these things that are being spoke about. There are whole systems there that address a lot of this. And like one of the elders that I work with and have for 26 years, she speaks that there's 2 ways to enlightenment. There's one where you're coming out of the body and you're essentially escaping the body, you're going for enlightenment, but that there's the other that somebody else spoke about a little bit. I think it was Marin, about coming into the body and being part of the earth. And how that is your check and balance, that and your community, that you don't step forward into a leadership position voluntarily. You're put there by the community because you have something to offer back. And so when you make mistakes, the community checks you and they basically say, okay, we're going to take you down a notch. Now, I'm also talking about more traditional communities versus or elders versus ones that maybe have become more urbanized or seek a little bit more of the financial capital type situations. But there's so much to learn from them and exemplified, and also from the aspect of how that when you have right relationship with the earth and our nature around us, how that also holds us into checks and balances and clears our beingness from a lot of the emotional human issues that come up when you have that relationship where you can ask, say, an oak tree to teach you. Then there are certain things that then comes into your embodied sense of being that are lessons that clear a lot of this out. And so it's the other thing I want to add is it is what the one gentleman was talking about the common man aspect. You know, the communities that I'm involved with, not only are those elders put there by the community status, but we also support them in a lot of ways financially, so that there's not this issue of becoming commercialized. And that's the first really big thing that they'll say is when you start seeing a lot of the commercialization of the spirituality, that's a red flag. That's something to start looking for, that somebody has stepped away from themselves a lot. So I just share that. It's a little bit all over the place, but it's just throwing a different concept of coming from a non-colonized way of being. So thanks.
Super. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you. And we are assuming that somebody is willing to, I need to learn from nature. I need to be embodied. It's like, sometimes we're looking at like, we need to place a light on that part of ourselves. Are we actually willing to have somebody watch our checks and balances? Are we willing to ask for support? How do we ask support? Are we willing to hear the answer if it comes, or does it have to be in a way that we will hear? Like, what do we filter out? What do we let in as regards us continuing to learn and to grow and to take care of our humanness? And not all spiritual leaders are willing to grow and be accountable. That's there too. Bill, we're close to the end.
Yes, I unless there are other comments, maybe we can draw it to a close. So I want to thank everybody for participating. I hope you found it of value, and I hope you let us, the ASI board, and know what your thoughts are. Give us feedback on this, whether we should do it again with other principles, whether we should add something that to the website that would help facilitate this kind of conversation, or any other suggestions you have. And of course, suggestions for subsequent webinars, which we try to do every 6 weeks. So and we're always discussing what topics we should have and what guests we should invite. So if you have suggestions, let us know. Any final words, anybody? Jack, you want to close us down?
Yeah, just thank you all, and we'll catch you downriver. See you next time.